In this last section of class, we're going to talk about punishment and sentencing. And before we get started, I just want to mention that we're going to take 2 weeks to do this. And this is the week that I'm wanting you to watch the Netflix movie 13th. And so I just want to remind you before, so you don't forget. Okay? Um, when we're talking about punishment and sentencing, what I'd like to do is start with the ultimate punishment, which is, of course, the death penalty. As you can see on this map, as of November 9th, 2016, there are 31 states that allow the death penalty. There are some states that, although technically there is a death penalty, governors have imposed a moratorium. You can see that Colorado right there is one of the states in which the death penalty is under a moratorium because of the governor. Obviously, if Colorado elects a new governor and that governor changes the moratorium, then they may be a death penalty state again. What we've seen over time is there are more states that are actually getting rid of the death penalty. About 15 years ago, 36 states had a death penalty, and now we're down to 31. The number of people on death row, those numbers vary, but there's about 3,000 people on death row in the United States at any given time. And the greatest number of people on death row are actually in California. Okay, and you'll see why in just a little bit. The number one state in terms of executions, I think we can all guess it, it is Texas. Texas has the most executions, death penalties that are carried out every single year. So for example, Harris County, Texas, where Houston is located, Harris County alone is number 2 in the nation for executions. And who's number 1? The rest of Texas. So Texas without Houston is number 1. Harris County is number 2. And Florida usually brings up the rear at number 3. So you can see that whether or not the death penalty is used depends on the states. However, even in the states that have death penalties, the methods that are used to carry out executions vary by state. I know most of you know that states use lethal injections, but some of you may not realize is that states vary in terms of what kinds of methods are legal. Okay, so for example, this is lethal injection. Okay, and you can see that virtually every state that has a death penalty, lethal injection is within the law, within statute, a legal way to carry out an execution. Some of you may not realize that there are other methods also. Electrocution. The electric chair is still legal in some states. And by the way, some of these unusual methods of carrying out an execution, some of these states kind of surprise you. Perhaps electrocution doesn't surprise you. It's the more southern states here. But let's look at firing squad. There are still 3 states that allow execution by a firing squad. Oklahoma, Utah, and Idaho. Okay. Hanging. Surprisingly enough, you've got 2 fairly liberal states in which hanging is still a legal method of execution. The gas chamber, okay, again, even in states where there is a death penalty, there can be some wide variation in terms of what is legal in terms of execution. Another thing that you should know or note is that, when we know that a state is a death penalty state, that doesn't really tell us much about their behavior. Because if you look at some states, they have a death penalty, but execution is extremely rare. And this is why probably California, for example, has so many people on death row, is because although they have a death penalty, they have not executed anyone since 2006. Okay, look at Wyoming. We have a death penalty. By the way, There's one person on death row here in Wyoming, uh, and but the last execution in Wyoming was in 1992. So although we have a death penalty, it's a very uncommon event for us to actually carry out. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the huge variation that you have in the United States. Now, another important part to consider with the death penalty is whether or not the public supports this. Because the Supreme Court has ruled that certain kinds of punishments are cruel and unusual. And usually what they use to guide their thinking on cruel and unusual punishment is public support. If there's wide public support for a punishment, the Supreme Court will often say that it's not cruel and unusual. However, if there's very little public support, the Supreme Court often will say that the punishment is cruel and unusual. So public support for the death penalty is important in keeping it as a legal punishment. If you look at public support, now I'm going to show you two different groups who have been keeping track of public support of the death penalty, but they tell the same story. This is the Gallup poll. You've got a Gallup poll now that has been asking this question: are you in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder? And you can see that Gallup has been asking this question for a very long time. What you see here is that in the 60s, support and opposition was almost, at its equal point. But then support for the death penalty in this country grew. And by the mid-1990s, support for the death penalty reached its highest peak ever, which was 80% of the population indicating that they supported the death penalty. But what you see has been going on since about 1995 is that support has been eroding. So in 2017, the Gallup poll indicated that 55% of Americans say, yes, they're in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder, but 41% are opposed. And this is a trend that seems to be continuing. Let's take a look at another poll. This is the Pew data. The Pew Foundation also asks the question about support for the death penalty. And what they find also is support for the death penalty is continuing to fall. Again, they ask a very similar question. Do you support the death penalty for someone convicted of murder? Again, you see that in 1995, there was a lot of support, but that support has been eroding and has been going away. And I want you to think for a moment, why do you think the support is eroding? What do you think is going on here? I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but there does seem to be an erosion. You have two different polling centers here, and both of them show very similar trends. Also, with the Pew data, you can get a little bit more information in terms of demographics. You can see what parts of the population tend to support and what parts of the population tend to oppose the death penalty. As you can see here, this is the Pew data. This was done in 2016. You can see that men typically are more supportive of the death penalty than women, and this is pretty true throughout the years. You also find there are racial differences and ethnic differences, with white people typically indicating more support than Black or Hispanic people. What's interesting here, I think, when you look at age, you can see that there's an erosion of support among this group of younger people. And that might be what's driving some of the support down. As older people die, who tend to be more supportive, and younger people who are less supportive, you may see that the population's shifting. Also, there's a tendency to be more supportive of the death penalty, the less education that you have. Not surprisingly, Republicans are more supportive of the death penalty than Democrats, okay? Where you see the independents are pretty split. What always surprises me is religion. White evangelicals are usually always the most supportive of the death penalty. Non-evangelical but mainline Christian whites also very supportive. Where you see a little bit of a drop-off is among Catholics, being less supportive. And it sort of fits with their views about the sanctity of life and so forth. The group that seems to be least supportive of the death penalty are those that indicate that they don't have any religious affiliation. So you can see that demographics can play a part in predicting who is likely to be in favor of the death penalty and not. And these are the kinds of demographics that attorneys will often use to try to get the right people seated as jurors. Now, I mentioned before, the fact that the support for the death penalty has been dropping off, and I wanted you to think about why that is. Well, I think one of the reasons why has to do with some high-profile cases that have come to the forefront in our country, high-profile cases that suggest that we might have made a mistake. So many people, in theory, are supportive of the death penalty, but they become less supportive if they find out that some innocent people have been put to death. Now, we saw the video of Carlos de Luna, who was executed in Texas, who was probably innocent. Okay, and so there was a very obvious mistake, and we saw that way back when we were talking about eyewitnesses. Another case that was very high profile is Cameron Todd Willingham. Cameron Todd Willingham was executed for setting fire to his house that killed his 3 children. So his 3 children were in the house. There was a fire in the house. All 3 children died. However, 8 years after his execution, there were some huge questions about the faulty forensic evidence that was presented at trial, the fact that there was some prosecutorial misconduct and that they may not have revealed exculpatory evidence in that trial. So there was a lot of political roiling about this case in Texas. So in 2009, there was a commission that was a forensic science commission that was looking into this case and said that the forensic evidence in the Willingham case was very doubtful. Interestingly enough, this case got mixed up in politics because then Governor Rick Perry, Rick Perry was the governor when Willingham was executed, and there was some indication that he was innocent even then. And Perry was unwilling to stay his execution and allow Mr. Willingham to be executed. But fast forward 8 years later, Rick Perry is still the governor of Texas, and it was very politically unpopular, the idea that he would have allowed an innocent man to die. So what happened was Governor Perry impeded the investigation into this case by replacing 3 of the 9 commission members with some of his own cronies. And so, again, lots of high-profile case, lots and lots of press, and it's pretty clear that Cameron Todd Willingham was probably innocent. Another very high-profile case, one that you saw in the Picking Cotton book, is the Troy Davis case. And Troy Davis, his execution got worldwide attention.
Night after the Supreme Court declined to intervene, convicted cop killer Troy Davis was put to death by the state of Georgia.
News 8's Keith Kunst following this story for us. He is now in the News 8 control room now with more. Keith?
All right, Darren and Sonia, thank you. The Davis case, perhaps more than any other in recent memory, has once again put the spotlight on the debate over capital punishment in this country. Those on both sides of that issue speaking out very strongly today.
Troy Davis maintained his innocence until the very end.
He said, the incident that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. And to the McPhail family, he said, of course, I did not personally kill your son, father, and brother. I am innocent.
His supporters fought for his life till the final hour.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
There were tears outside the White House, pleas at the Georgia State Capitol. There were hours of hope when the U.S. Supreme Court issued a temporary stay to consider the issues. No murder weapon, 7 witnesses recanting their testimony, most of them claiming police pressured them to lie.
This, by our constitutional standards, by any human standards, is cruel and unusual punishment.
In the end, it was not enough. the court allowed the execution to go forward.
You are executing a man where you know you cannot prove he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Davis was executed for the 1989 murder of off-duty police officer Mark McPhail. His family said they were certain the right man was executed.
The last 22 years have been held.
The case drew worldwide attention. Everyone from the Pope to Kim Kardashian called for the case to be reviewed.
Make no mistakes, they call it an execution. We call it murder.
Before he died, Davis turned to the prison staff who were carrying out his lethal injection and said, "May God have mercy on your souls."
And tonight, Davis's supporters continue to ask some very hard questions. Among them, would the case have received even closer review if he were white and not African American? So this case surely to be the topic of much discussion for days and months to come. Sonia, back to you.
So as you can see, that case was a very high profile case, and it wasn't that long ago. And I'm mentioning 3 cases here, but there are many others. And some of these got more press in some parts of the country than others. But certainly people are becoming aware. So this is some information from the Death Penalty Information Center, and this is the list of people who were probably executed, not probably, they were executed, who were probably innocent. There's Carlos de Luna, but you can see the list is quite long. So Reuben Cantu, Larry Griffin, Joseph Odell, David Spence, Leo Jones, Gary Graham, Claude Jones, Willingham that I just mentioned, Troy Davis, Lester Bauer, Terrell. It goes on and on and on. And I think it's cases like these that have caused people to think twice about whether the death penalty is the right penalty at all. Certainly this is something that you should continue to look into, because at some point, is the opposition to the death penalty going to be greater than the support for it? Okay, so those people who support the death penalty often talk about the death penalty as being a deterrent. So the deterrence argument. So the idea here is, knowing that you could be put to death, it will stop you from doing something, because you're afraid you're going to get caught and then be put to death. Also, there's sort of this, what they call the individual deterrence. It's the ultimate deterrence. That person will not commit another crime. So not only is it supposed to be a general deterrence, keeping other people from doing it, it's also an individual deterrence in the sense that that individual will never murder anyone again. Of course, the question's always been, obviously it's an individual deterrence, but whether or not the death penalty is a general deterrent is a matter of debate. So does it deter crime? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we can look at this. One thing you can do is you can compare states with the death penalty and look at states without the death penalty. If having a death penalty is a general deterrent, you would expect the murder rates to be lower in states with a death penalty than states without a death penalty. And if you actually look at the data really doesn't support it. The states with the lowest homicide rates, actually 3 out of the 4 with the lowest homicide rates don't have the death penalty. And in the 10 states that where the homicide rates are the highest, they all have the death penalty. So for example, Louisiana has a death penalty and also has a fairly high homicide rate. Okay, so if you compare states with and without the death penalty, it doesn't suggest that the death penalty is a general deterrent. Another way you might be able to do this is to compare states within states. It's so hard to compare between states because they're quite different in many different ways, not just with regard to the death penalty. But you can compare states before and after reintroduction of the death penalty and before and after they get rid of the death penalty. I don't know if some of you realize this, but between 1972 and 1976, there was no death penalty in the country. The Supreme Court had ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional because there were some huge racial disparities. Many more African Americans were getting the death penalty than whites for the same crimes. So the Supreme Court suspended the death penalty and made states reevaluate their statutes to get rid of the racial disparities. So every state didn't have a death penalty between 72 and 76. And so you could compare the homicide rates of those states during that time to the years before when they did have the death penalty. And you could also look at them once they reintroduced the death penalty. When you look at the data within states, again, you don't find any difference in the states when they had the death penalty and when they didn't. In other words, the data seems to be pretty clear that it is not good as a general deterrent. So what do we do? You know, I think it's fair to say that at least the way we do the death penalty, it's probably not a general deterrent. But if you go back into psychology and look at learning, go back to your learning class, go back to Skinner, operant conditioning, you go back to Bandura, observational learning. One of the things that you know about this is that the outcome has to happen pretty close to the time that the behavior occurs, right? Skinner says that if you are rewarded for a behavior, you're more likely to do it. If you have a negative consequence, you're less likely to do it. And of course, the death penalty is supposed to be a negative consequence. But this little cartoon, I think, shows you exactly what the problem might be in this country. Maybe the death penalty is not a deterrent because there is such a long time between the time the person is convicted and given the death penalty and then the death penalty is actually carried out. So because of that long amount of time, any deterrence effect that it might have might be washed out. So I think it's fair to say that the death penalty is probably not a deterrent, at least the way we do it. But if we did it more efficiently, and I'm going to use air quotes, you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes around efficiently. If we did it more efficiently, could it be a deterrent? Who knows? Okay. Before we quit here, I want to talk about a couple of important cases with regard to the death penalty. The Supreme Court has had to weigh in a couple of times about whether or not the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment for certain populations. So the first is whether or not the death penalty is cruel and unusual for individuals with a mental disability. And specifically what we're talking about here is an intellectual disability. In 2002, the Supreme Court ruled in Atkins versus Virginia, they ruled that in fact the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment for someone with a significant mental disability. So someone with what we would call, and by the way, the law still refers to intellectual disabilities as mental retardation. So the Supreme Court ruled that somebody who has a mental retardation should not be executed. Unfortunately, the courts disagreed about what criteria they should use for defining a mental disability. You know that the psychologists, educators often define intellectual disabilities by an IQ score and also by your ability to function in your community. But the Supreme Court didn't have that kind of background, so they disagreed about what cutoff level they should use for an intellectual disability. So what they did was they ended up leaving up the definition to the individual states. Now that may have been a mistake. And this is probably something the Supreme Court will have to come back and clean up. Because what happened is that almost every state decided to use criteria that are fairly consistent with educators and psychologists. However, maybe no surprise to some of you, Texas made up their own criteria. Okay, what they said was they developed some criteria that are unique to them. They're called Bresenio factors. Bresenio factors are named after a Texas defendant that was on death row. These Bresenio factors are not used by any scientists or any clinicians to determine mental capacity, but the Bresenio factors are, these are the factors that suggest that you do not have a mental disability. So, ready? If you're married, if you have children, if you have a job, and if you lie in your own self-interest. They are suggesting that if somebody lies, lies to cover up their own behavior, then they do not have an intellectual disability. Let that sink in for a second. I don't know how many of you have ever been with children who are 2 years of age, 3 years of age, 4 years of age. Do they lie to cover up their own misbehavior? I mean, they may not be very good at it, but they certainly are able to do it. And would you then say an adult who's functioning as a 3-year-old could not make up a lie? And if he does, then he's not intellectually disabled. It's kind of an interesting argument. One case that may end up going to the Supreme Court, Marvin Wilson was executed, but it got close in terms of the courts having to weigh in here. Marvin Wilson, he was by all criteria intellectually disabled. Okay, he's 54 years old, and he was convicted of a murder, obviously, but because he had a job, okay, Wilson's IQ, according to this article, his IQ is only 61, which falls way under the legal standard for an intellectual disability. And of course, using some of those Bresenio factors, Texas argued that they could execute Marvin Lee Wilson, and he in fact was executed on August 7th. This is just one of those examples where the Supreme Court did make a decision. However, Texas, they left open a loophole that some states, particularly Texas, is willing to kind of push the limits on. Okay, what about juveniles? Well, originally in our country, the death penalty was actually okay for juveniles. In fact, the first juvenile who was executed in this country was Thomas Grounger in 1642. He was executed for bestiality. Okay. Since then, and this number varies depending on what you're talking about. Now, I want you to keep in mind here, when I talk about juvenile executions, I mean they were juveniles at the time they committed the crime. They may not be juveniles at the time of the executions. So we had a long history in our country of juveniles being eligible for the death penalty. But there were some important cases that changed that. The first case was Stanford versus Kentucky. In that particular case, 2 juveniles who were 17 years of age went into a convenience store, robbed the convenience store, kidnapped the clerk. They took her out into a wooded area and raped and murdered her. And so that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in fact, said that yes, they could be executed. But for the first time, the Supreme Court set a specific age. So anyone who was under 16 at the time of that they committed a crime would no longer be eligible for execution. Before that time, before 1989, there was no age. So what the Supreme Court did was they set a lower age limit in terms of the death penalty. In 2005, the Supreme Court weighed in again and actually got rid of the death penalty for anyone who committed a murder under the age of 18. So even if you were tried as an adult, you cannot be executed if you were under the age of 18 at the time that you committed a crime. So in other words, the only sentence that you can get is life in prison. And by the way, the Supreme Court has weighed in again, saying that even life in prison may not be the right standard for young people who commit murder. Okay, before we end, I just want to introduce you to a pretty egregious case. It was the youngest person in our country who was executed. This is George Stinney, and he was 14 when he was found guilty of murder, and he was executed. And it was this particular case was a great injustice. I have a little video here that describes the Stinney case. Now, this comes from the Young Turks. I don't usually consider them a very good source of information because they tend to be a little bit biased, but I think they do a good job in explaining the Stinney case and give you a good idea of what was going on here. I think it's not going to work. Well, I guess what I'll do is I'll put the video of the Stinney case up for you because it's a horrible story. In December 16th in 2014, through the efforts of a lot of people, George Stinney was finally exonerated. So we add George Stinney to the group of people who have been executed in this country who were probably innocent. So I'll put that little video up as a separate URL. So please watch it because it's a very interesting case and it's a kind of a dark part of our history, what happened to George Stinney.